It's time to start thinking about planting tomatoes in the garden. Of course, if you're in southern Oklahoma, you may already have them in the ground. Central Oklahoma, again, you want to wait till about April 15th. And out in the Panhandle, wait another week or 10 days so that we have some frost-free weather. Now, if you are selecting tomato plants at a garden center, make sure you select varieties that are suited to your situation. Tomatoes come in basically two groups of varieties. There are the determinate types, such as this bush type, that will only get so tall and they'll continue to set flowers through the season on those plants and stay fairly bushy in the garden. In fact, this one already has some flower buds forming on it. Then there are the indeterminate or the climbing type tomatoes, and you're going to need to do some kind of training on these so that they don't sprawl all over the place and fall over. To maintain production, you probably want to train them to a stake or have them in a cage or some way of supporting them through the season. It'll be a while until these start setting blossoms, and they will continue to grow and just get taller and taller through the season. When choosing tomato varieties in general, make sure that you choose varieties that have VFN after the name. We talk about that a lot when we talk about tomatoes, but it's important. In Oklahoma soils, we have a problem with a disease called fusarium wilt. And if you've ever experienced that around mid-season, you'll never forget it. That's the disease that is soil-borne. It causes the tomatoes to turn yellow and wilt from the bottom up, and they die very rapidly about midsummer. Fusarium wilt is what the letter F stands for in VFN varieties. Now, some new varieties are resistant to verticillium wilt, which is what the V stands for, and they're resistant to two races of fusarium wilt. And that variety will have V, F1, F2 after the name. Floridate is an example of that. Now, some new varieties have V, F1, F2, N, and then the letter T afterwards. And the T means that they are resistant to a mosaic virus that affects tomatoes as well. If you can get the most disease resistance possible, you'll be ahead quite a bit in the season. Now, in planting tomatoes, make sure that you select as stocky ones as possible. These have been growing in 4-inch peat pots, and they look really great. Of course, they've been in a greenhouse and been protected. And if you buy plants directly from a garden center, make sure that you harden them off for a few days before planting. They may have come directly out of a greenhouse. Either set them out in the bright sunlight and wind for a couple hours each day before planting to toughen them up, or when you do plant them, put a big coffee can or some protection from the wind around them. If they're growing in peat pots such as these, make sure that you break the sides down. And that just simply means tearing this one edge of peat moss away, because that will act as a wick. And when you plant the tomato in the ground, if you had left that edge on there and some of it is sticking above the soil line, that can wick out moisture from around the root mass of tomato. So make sure that you tear that away before planting. You can just tear that up and put it in the hole. It just adds a little bit of organic matter. Now, if you've had trouble in the past with tomatoes getting blossom end rot in the early summer, and this is a disease that causes the black softened areas on the undersides of the fruit, it'd be a good idea to add a little bit of lime to your planting hole. That will provide some calcium and possibly prevent problems with blossom end rot. This spring, I've noticed some of the garden centers carrying a calcium liquid spray that you can put on tomatoes to prevent blossom end rot. This is another possibility, but just make sure that they do get plenty of calcium if you've had that problem in the past. Now, if you've grown your own tomato transplants and they've gotten tall and leggy, or if you've bought them someplace where they've been grown in crowded conditions, you can plant that just as deep as you want to. We could plant it right up to the very tip of this growth. And one way to do that, other than planting or digging a very deep hole, is to first, again, tear away that edge of peat moss around the side of the plant and then plant it in a trench. I've already dug one here. One thing you might want to do is break off some of these lower leaves. If you'll notice on tomatoes, they will form roots all the way up the side of the stem. In fact, right here, I've got some small root initials just now forming. And that is a sign that this was growing under crowded conditions and it's trying to put roots out further up. So just lay that in the hole. And even though our root mass is over here, the tomato shoot's coming up over here. And it'll give you a good, strong start. The tomato should be nice and stocky, should do just fine. But one thing you want to keep in mind is if you do plant in a trench like this and you're hoeing, don't forget that your stem is running just a few inches beneath here. So it might be a good idea to put some mulch around the plant to mark where it's been planted and then only hoe in between. Now on tomatoes, keep in mind that they must have plenty of fertilizer through the season. Long about the time that your tomatoes are setting and get about golf ball size, it's a good time to side dress them with some nitrogen fertilizer. And watch out for your insect pests as well. Aphids can get ahead of you. Be sure you use some insecticidal soap for that problem. Watch for spider mites. We talked about that earlier in the show today on marigolds. On tomatoes, it can be a problem as well. You might want to hose them down fairly frequently and avoid a buildup of the problem. On tomatoes, one other thing people sometimes talk about is suckering them. And this is beneficial if you're trying to train them straight against a stake of some kind, or if you're using the stake and weave method, which is something we did in our garden last year. And by breaking off any new shoots that are coming out of the lower leaf axils, you'll encourage the top to grow straight and tall. One other advantage to this is that it will give plenty of aeration around the very bottom of the plant. And it's just a matter of snipping that out, and they can be even larger than that. The lower two suckers that are coming out of these lower two leaf axils, just break those off. That'll get the plant growing straight and tall against a stake or other method that you're training them against, some kind of trellis or what have you. Now some other warm season crops that can go in right now are beans and corn. And with sweet corn and with beans, they're both quite susceptible to some of the soil diseases that will rot young seedlings. It's important to check your soil temperature. Just a regular thermometer will do if you'll put it down in the soil. It needs to be around 55 or 60 degrees for ideal germination conditions. Now, some people like to soak their vegetable seeds overnight before planting them in soil. With beans, make sure that you don't do that. What happens is if you soak these bean seed in water overnight, they will absorb moisture too quickly. And the little seeds will split in half, will not germinate properly. In fact, you'll have a much poorer germination than if you'd sown them in just regular soil that has a normal amount of moisture. So don't soak them in water overnight. In addition, we talk a lot about inoculating your seeds. We've done that on peas before. Make sure you do that on beans as well for good germination. On sweet corn, you can plant that, but remember on the super sweet varieties to wait probably another week or two before sowing those because they must have a warm soil for good germination. Make sure that you do a succession planting. Do, say, a third of your sweet corn planting this week and repeat that at 2-week intervals so you have a staggered harvest. And one thing I want to elaborate on is with these new super sweet varieties. Those don't have to be isolated if you're planting all super sweet varieties in one planting. For instance, with early extra sweet and Snowbell and some of the other extra sweet types, just make sure that they're all super sweets and you won't have to worry too much about cross-pollination and starchiness. With the old regulars like Country Gentleman or Merit, you don't need to worry about separating those at all for pollination. Again, on sweet corn, make sure you sow it plenty thick. It's better to use a little extra seed and make sure that you have a thick stand. There are a lot of other warm season vegetables that can go in this month. With tomatoes, beans, and sweet corn, hopefully you've got a few tips to get you off to a good start this season. We'll see you next week on Oklahoma Gardening.